has many distinctions for a long and prosperous career in public health. He's going to talk to us this morning about public health emergencies, the common thread. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. It is a real honor to be here. It's the kind of audience I really like to talk to. Because actually I am going to talk to you about what's coming in the future. I've talked about public health emergencies for a long time. I was one of the ones who coined that term many years ago. But along the lines of, when we look at crises, disasters, and all the rest of the stuff, actually as students, as scholars in the field, we tended to focus in on each one, sort of memorize what we knew about them and things like that. And no one ever talked about a common thread. Okay? Many of the events that, boom, happened, over with, things like that, don't really have a big, if any, public health component. But the real disasters that we talk about, large-scale ones, things like wars, pandemics, as soon as a pandemic happens, it's a public health emergency. And I'll tell you the reasons why. But it is important, and it really makes your life a bit more sane if you approach these as public health emergencies. We all get caught up as professionals, but certainly the citizenry, media, politicians, in the emergency phase of things. But it is clear that all large-scale kinds of crises, more people die from the preventable public health aspects, what we call indirect indices, measures, than they do from the direct. So that's what I'm going to talk about. But I've done this in various ways, finding out from Christy the audiences. I decided that rather than talk about the years of war that I've been in, which have all turned out to be public health emergencies and learned a great deal from it, just really touch on it briefly and then go really into the emergencies, essentially the future humanitarian crisis. I think that's very, very important because the wars that we've been through, especially in the last 3 decades, will pale compared to the events that are on our doorstep. Okay. Now, I am a physician. I've been trained first in pediatrics, ordered in pediatric emergency medicine. I was professor and chairman of emergency medicine. I'm also a psychiatrist, so I can read your minds. And don't you think that? Obviously, I have a public health degree, and I have pulmonary tropical medicine. Now, I did all these things because I wanted to do international health. There was nothing to guide me years ago, nothing at all. Well, when I started going to do things internationally, I recognized, oh my God, I really need to know something about that. Okay. And I guess it's my own obsessive-compulsive behavior that I decided, well, just not learning something about mental health, but becoming a psychiatrist was going to be important. And if I wasn't 70 years old, I would be going back and getting a law degree, but just an international law, because you do all of those things. But I was actually trained by the Swiss, the ICRC, and international humanitarian law. You use all of what I have just told you. But we have training programs now that do a very good job. And so we now, if you look at, from the health side, if you look at Harvard, Hopkins, and Columbia, the major ones that we send people to, or have established programs, there are others. But we're graduating about 200 a year that call themselves humanitarian professionals. About a decade ago, there were about 100,000 people who claim that they are a humanitarian professional. Everything from management to logistics to health, communications, things like that. Now we're a little bit shy of 200,000. But I will tell you that if with some of the large events and some of the ones we anticipate, which I'll talk about, we can field enough people to manage about 100 million people. And that's going to be a real stretch. certainly has the potential to cause more problems than just that. But so let's save the questions near the end and sort of write them down as we go along. If you have any particular questions, in some ways, it's almost a survey course. Although I want to be sure that you understand the common thread, understand the differences between direct and indirect measures, indices. It's extremely important. And certainly understand, where you have to concentrate public health. I was telling Amy, or I think it was, that a number of years ago, I was interviewed for the Lancet on the Lifeline. They interviewed somebody and then published the answers. And one of the questions asked of me was, what do you think the most exciting field for the future is? Some question like that. And I said public health. I think they almost fell off their chairs. But so that was about 6-7 years ago. I think if they asked me the question again and I said it, they wouldn't be surprised. It is also interesting too that most medical specialties, so like internal medicine, pediatrics, that began back in the 30s as specialty areas. In about 12 to 15 years, there was then a bevy of internists, or pediatricians, and then even surgeons, and then, as a matter of fact, emergency physicians, who, after they got their boards, so they were obviously established, decided that something was missing. And so a good number of all of them went back to get their public health degree. Now, Johns Hopkins, I'm on the faculty also, it's about 12 years ago. But Hopkins had nothing to do with this, but all of a sudden they realized that they were getting a large number of students coming in, getting their masters in public health that were economists, they were lawyers, and they were engineers. So they themselves knew that there was something about what they do, or what they were planning to do, especially if it had some global impact, that they knew that they needed to get some grounding in public health. So some of the other people know more. The other thing too, I'll talk a little bit about this, but I have to tell you right now, I don't know how you define public health, but even when I got my MPH at Berkeley, there were the majority of people thinking that it was about water and sanitation and sanitarians and whatever. And as a matter of fact, you need to understand that most of the people out there in the world, especially in politics, still think that. The definition of public health is changing a lot. Right now, when we talk about public health is what allows a village, a town, a city, a nation state, and now globally to function. It's transportation, it's communication, it's economics, it's governance, it's public safety, it's judiciary, it's all of those things. And if you think about it, when any of them measure whether they're successful or failing in their endeavors, and certainly all the UN agencies use public health indicators to measure their success. So it's something that's very uniform about public health. And so that's extremely important for all of you to recognize. So anyways, get back to the, what's dominated our attention certainly for the last 3 decades have been conventional wars, things that cross borders. The internal complex emergencies, if you don't know what that means, they're the events that happened after the Cold War, post-Cold War era in all of these countries that were trying to become independent. And primarily started wars over territory and resources. but they were internal, not covered by international law, so we had to find very inventive ways to get involved with peacekeepers or peace enforcers and things like that. And then asymmetrical warfare, which is entirely different, and that's what's happening still in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was the first Minister of Health in Iraq. I worked for Colin Powell, and I planned for the issues in Iraq. We had a Futures of Iraq task forces, 17 of them, and quite honestly, it predicted everything that happened. I had real difficulties with non-special people. So a lot of what happened in that kind of situation didn't have to happen, but the main thing is that I was the first one to go in, first diplomat. I went to Baghdad, I was still under fire, simply because the looting had occurred. The Department of Defense had removed my slide about that, but I declared it was a public health emergency, and I was stepped on and told, no, it's not. And after we finish this talk, you'll certainly understand, if you don't already know, probably one of the most egregious public health emergencies is indeed Iraq. But anyways, all of these things have dominated our attention. And quite honestly, there are a number of articles even now that talk about the fact that the attention of the U.S., because it has some real leadership in the world, has really taken away and delayed and probably caused considerable problems in efforts in things like climate change, but many other issues, okay, because of the attention. But remember, as I said, these conventional wars and all the rest of stuff are measured how? See it on television? It's deaths, right? Mortality and morbidity. And those are direct, okay? Those are direct measures. We need to understand that if we look at all wars, the number of people who die from violent, shooting, the direct deaths, is rarely over 11% of the total deaths. So, just hold on to that as we go along. Public health emergencies are disasters that adversely impact the public health system and infrastructure. And this protective infrastructure. I mean, take it for example. You can turn on a faucet, you can take a shower, you can drink the water with some assurance. Okay, some assurance. You know, I mean, there's so many things that we have going. It's automatic. And it's also terribly underfunded in the United States. And so when things happen financially, where do they pull a lot of the money from? Public health departments. But one of the big problems, at least in this country, is the fact that public health is our political appointees, very tied to politics. And so you often don't have the transparency that you might in other places. We tend to measure along water, sanitation, food, health, and shelter. So the protective threshold is destroyed. Where? In war. That's why we measure it. We can go in and see the response when the public health infrastructure system is destroyed. We can see how rapidly all the things happen, and morbidity and mortality and things like that. So we know an awful lot from the wars. It can be overwhelmed. Katrina, public health system is overwhelmed. I'll tell you about that. Not recovered. Well, the southern part of Iraq, which was where the Shia were, you know, that's where, during the first Persian Gulf War, most of it was destroyed. Well, Saddam said, I ain't going to recover that. So when we entered Iraq, the southern part of Iraq, the Shia areas, Basra, up to almost Karbala, the south of Baghdad, had terrible, terrible health indices. Okay, like infant mortality rate, under age 5 mortality rate. You all, that's not foreign to anything, okay? Baghdad was different, fairly sophisticated. It was called the medical pearl of the Middle East, and people actually came, lots of surgery, not much in the way of public health and infectious disease things, but because people wanted to make money from these things. And then what turned out to be the Sunni Triangle had a different set. And then Kurdistan, which had been helped and assisted since the end of the Persian Gulf War, had wonderful health industries, and we're building nursing schools and medical schools and things like that. So there's no one health industry that's described that country, okay? But that was never recovered. And so they had the worst ones in the South were maintained or denied. And one of the things we know with the last 3 decades of internal complex emergencies is that we've had ethnic groups, religious groups, and genders that have been denied protective infrastructure. Okay? And with that, mortality, morbidity rates higher. But again, we measure these things as indirect, preventable. Excess mortality often is usually the preventable ones. We have fairly good statistics about the direct, despite the fact of all the controversy about the Iraq mortality study, which I was certainly heavily involved in. And believe it or not, we're going to try to close the circle. We're going to do the third Iraq mortality study. It's already planned. But we do not have very good figures about indirect mortality. So public health emergencies can occur in war and conflict. It's large-scale natural disasters, and certainly sometimes there's a debate about what natural catastrophes mean. We'll just give you an example: Katrina, Indian Ocean tsunamis, naturally occurring epidemics and pandemics. And as I said, a pandemic, as soon as it happens, is a public health emergency because there is no country in the world that has all the resources required to handle a pandemic. One of the reasons why we have an international health regulation, which is a treaty, that requires all countries under the United Nations to have surveillance systems and this, that, and the other thing, because it is necessary for control of the pandemic. It's also one of the grand experiments. In any deliberate biological, chemical, radiation kinds of things, we'll all know. But also you need to understand what's really different about, especially with the asymmetric kinds of issues that we have right now. But inequities, poverty, injustice, oppression, racism, religious fundamentalism, they all have a tremendous impact. But that impact can be grossly measured, how it adversely affects the public health. You need to understand. Because you wonder, gee, I'm doing this right, what are the other things? These are all the things that deny, through these elements, people from essentially getting public health protections. Okay? So I think that would be the introduction. So we entered the 21st century. Globally, the public health infrastructure systems, most of them disappeared. They disappeared in many African countries. Many. And they were pretty good, even post-colonial. They declined or failed to keep pace with the demands. I remember Obama saying, we want to put money into building up the public health infrastructure and systems. To tell you the truth, it would be getting everybody back to work. And it will globally. Deficient dwellings, aged infrastructure, and tied really to the third point, unavailable infrastructure and capacity to respond if indeed there is a crisis. Right now, it's handling a lot of population issues. With a crisis on top of it, that's when it shows its ugly head. So years ago, actually in the 70s, I wrote in one of the papers that disasters keep governments honest by defining the public health and exposing its vulnerabilities. Think about it. Everybody thinks it's fine. The Katrina comes. Okay. Did it expose the public health? Yes, of course it did. And the vulnerabilities. Right? Despite the fact that for over 3 decades, good scientists have been telling them to fix the levees, okay, or bring back the wetlands. Right? Wetlands are essentially horizontal levees, okay? And that's why they put vertical ones up there when they destroy the horizontal ones, but whatever is good. And ecological environmental changes. Haiti, as I said, is an absolute environmental ecological disaster. And you have to study Haiti because there's nothing that can be done. So a hurricane comes through, hits Florida, and maybe 10 or 12 people die from direct effects. You got hit in the head by a piece of roofing and things like that, right? The same hurricane goes through Haiti, directly kills 10 or 12 people. over the next 2 weeks, between 3,000 and 5,000 people die in Haiti because of flooding, mudslides, etc. Understand? And why do they have the mudslides and the flooding in Haiti?
Infrastructure.
What?
For infrastructure?
No, they cut down all the trees. They have 2% of the original trees, so there's no roots to contain it. And they have been trying to get the trees back. USAID did it 20, 30 years ago. It's continually failed.
Is that a man-made or a natural disaster?
Man-made it started with Spain. The French did it. They all cut down all the trees to make boats. And back in the 1800s. That's where it started. Okay? And it is continuing. All right. So these are the future ones. We have some remnants of asymmetrical warfare, and that will continue in some variation of the theme. But we're going to talk about biodiversity crises, post-conflict environments, climate change, large-scale natural disasters, or whatever you want to call it, pandemics, megacities and globalizations, and emergencies of scarcity, which you need to know. Now, that is what my generation is leaving your generation. Okay? We just didn't think you'd have anything that, we couldn't cure everything. Okay? So let's talk about these things. First off, you know about conventional war, you study it, World War II, and Korean War, and things like that, and cross-border. The whole UN Charter is written for cross-border wars. It has absolutely no applicability. You can curse the UN and the Secretary General and all the rest of the stuff, but they are limited by their charter. And they can't do anything, okay? Because it really has nothing to do with the kinds of conflicts and things like that. So you can't, if you look at the charter, genocide, peacekeeping, peace and war, they're not in there. These are terms brought in by other organizations. So it has nothing to do with modern day. So we certainly do need to have a reformed charter. It is unfortunately countries like the United States who have continually balked at changing the charter. So it's become somewhat ineffectual. But the conventional wars have changed. We now have asymmetrical warfare, so think of Iraq. But the attempt there was, and we certainly have it in Afghanistan, but now we have a general who's saying, well, I think we're going to try to protect the civilians as winning. We certainly sort of tried to do that with the surge in Iraq. The point is that all the humanitarian organizations, the UN, including me, said this is not a conventional war, but we kept putting more conventional warfare against it. The important point is that this is where the attention has been put on the warfare. These other two, and this is out of an article I wrote in Lancet, are equal. First off, the security issues are just not with the military. It's for everybody in the entire country. And so who has more deaths than any group? About 25,000 Iraqi soldiers have died, but 150,000 in one group, and another study, about 600,000 have died. And the other thing that's just as important is the fact that as long as it goes on, it produces a prolonged public health emergency. Terribly egregious. So you're not going to make any headway if you just focus on that. And this is pretty elementary. The military is just now understanding this. So some examples. Now the war started started and ended essentially April 2003. But the first new Iraqi Minister of Health came on in April 2004. And what his first act was to start a surveillance system. Is that a surveillance system sort of basic to public health? So we do not know how many people died before that time. We do not. We certainly did not have death certificates, which of course are elementary there in the Middle East. We do that. Okay? And just to start with seeing how many civilians died and common health issues a year, and really more than that. By October 2004, the fledgling Ministry of Health, along with the International Committee Red Cross, developed a Ministry of Health report that showed that public health was actually a major concern. What that is that no surprise to most of us, that by then there were more people dying from public health causes than from boom. Okay? If you've not heard of this, I'm not surprised because it got absolutely no press whatsoever. Okay? None at all. But some indices that help us. Oxfam, we started off with about a 22% chronic malnutrition. So that's chronic malnutrition ends up with what? Stunting. Doesn't mean that kids have had malnutrition for quite a while. Okay, it's not acute malnutrition, all right? So run up to 28%. That's a very big jump. Okay, but the infant mortality rate is extremely important. It's what we call like composite indices. And the infant mortality rate, quite honestly, gang, has very little to do with antenatal, prenatal, and postnatal mortality. It measures governance, it measures communication, it measures education, it measures capacity to have laws, and a whole bunch of other things, okay? So you can have the best antenatal program or prenatal program and postnatal program, but if you don't have these other things, the infant mortality rate is always going to be quite high. So we call it a composite indicator, all right? And good governance is one of the most important things. If you haven't read the book by Andrew Price Smith, Health of Nations, now, Andrew and I just got finished talking at a conference together, keynote speakers, but he is a political scientist by training. And his hypothesis was that infectious diseases, the capacity of a government to handle infectious diseases was the most sensitive indicator of governance. They couldn't find anything else that was as sensitive. Now, you say, well, why not earthquakes? Well, other disasters, specific components of a government take care of it. Okay? But infectious diseases, like an epidemic or pandemic, requires coordination, unprecedented coordination and collaboration of all government kinds. So bring it back, however, to a war kind of situation. The infant mortality was actually quite acceptable in Iraq before the war. However, now it is among the 4 highest death rates worldwide. So they share it with Liberia, Afghanistan, and Sierra Leone. Quite a commentary. So it does measure the fact that the whole governmental system is falling apart. And so water, sanitation, shelter, food, and all of that is actually worse than it was prior to the war. So when we set a public health emergency, indeed it was. Post-conflict environments. Well, you need to know that, again, this blue line here is a number of direct deaths that happened during the war. After a bit, when the system and the infrastructure is destroyed, we start seeing the indirect deaths, the preventable ones, going up. Right? The shooting stops. Slowly, the direct deaths go down, but the indirect deaths continue to go up, and they continue to go up and do not come back to the baseline for almost a decade. So this is what we call the decay function. It extends up to 10 years. It may even be longer because a lot of these countries go back to war. But if you look at Central Africa studies that looked at the wars between 1999 and 2005, that the indirect deaths during the conflict period made up 71% of the deaths. And they range anywhere from the 60s to the 90s. Okay? In the Congo, if you remember Les Roberts' excess mortality study, he showed that between 2 and 4 million people died during a 4-month period in the Congo. And they said, it's terrible. And of course, all the TV showed the AK-47s and this, that, and the other. But only 10%, if we take the lowest confidence interval, the lowest, 2 million, only 10% of those people died from the shooting. The majority, 90%, died from malaria, malnutrition, dehydration, etc. Okay, all preventable public health issues. Okay, 6 months after the shooting has stopped, the indirect deaths went up to 83%. Okay? Dropped down in this study to 45% in 4 years. Okay? Who are these people? They're primarily women, children, mental health. They're all members of the population. But these are the most vulnerable because the public health infrastructure doesn't come back. So if you want to know what is the most dangerous time, it's the transition period, which can extend from years after the war has stopped. That's when the death rates go up. And you're saying, well, why don't we hear about this? Now, when the war is declared over, the non-governmental organizations take off, the donors take off, the UN takes off. The money isn't there, and we forget about it. All of these things we say in the humanitarian community, we talk about the 2 A's. Anything we do is try to improve the access and the availability of health care. When that's worsened during this post-conflict time, in every country, whether it's Afghanistan, Katrina, Croatia, suicide, depression, alcohol, and drug rates go extremely high. Okay? A lot of them are out-of-work males and IDPs. Croatia, if you know anything about the Yugoslav war, Croatia was the one country that sort of came out of it not doing too bad. I mean, they all did badly, but a few people know that after the declaration was signed, the accords were signed, and people went home, soldiers went home. There were 700 suicides among Croatian soldiers. So that's a big chunk. Gender-based violence. I hope all of you have heard of this. There's a lot of writings. Why do we do it? Well, it's the intimate partner rates, essentially, that is one of the most sensitive markers of community breakdown and economic and physical insecurity. There are other things that are going on, but we use these as proxy indicators, okay, to tell us that there is something wrong in the society. It goes up tremendously after the war. So in Congo, Iraq, Katrina, we can put all of them. Okay? So you have some natural disasters and war. Number of girls in school. And that period afterwards is a terrible financial strife. And even with globalization, now the financial strife, a lot of those countries never had to pay for their kids' schooling, but now they do. So who doesn't go to school? It's the girl in the family. A study just in Lancet out of Afghanistan looked at mental health. Wasn't surprised at all by Lynn Jones, really quite good. But it showed the fact that the mortality rates were higher in girls. And the reason being is that they weren't going to school. And in most of these countries, the only health care is done during school. So you're going to see. Remember, Mother Nature and epidemiology is in charge. I'm quite sure that God was an epidemiologist. But one of the things that, this is part of the study that we've done, and for the first time since '94, we have less declared wars than at any other time, okay? So you have less deaths, the blue one, due to conflict. But what we have is we have more people living in post-conflict environments, the ones we've forgotten about. Okay, we say, okay, it's over with, let's go on to the next thing, okay, because we're just emergency NGOs, all right, and that's what we do, right? But what we did is, and there are a lot of different State Department and other kinds of programs that look at these countries, things like that. Forget about it. You've got to go to the country and you've got to ask the people. And the people said there is still violence going on. Various levels of intensity. But what we found was that all post-conflict countries still had some level of conflict. Okay? So it's quite a myth. There's no real post-conflict environment. But the difference between the populations of war and post-conflict is actually getting blurred with this low level of conflict intensity. So people don't see where something changed them, right? So that doesn't mean that there's really peace out there. And I don't know how many of you have done anything internationally, but you talk to the State Department, talk to the military especially. And so they sort of judge the countries that they're either permissive, meaning that the Mediterranean community can go in there, non-permissive, that they can't even when the war is over, and then semi-permissive. Okay, so we've got these terms to describe something that, quite honestly, people haven't even tried to understand or recognize, because nobody really wants to know that, recognize that the war is still going on. Now, we looked at 303 countries, 28 currently going on with war since World War II, up through, so 1949, end of World War II, to present time. And what we found, there were a number of things we measured, from fatalities, casualties, to political disruption, social disruption, et cetera, et cetera. And there's 10 different levels, but the yellow one is level 1, still something going on, but the least, all right? And what you see is that conflict plus 10 years, we did conflict plus 5 years. So the end of the conflict, when there was a declaration or something signed, 5 years and then 10 years, the majority of countries, there's still levels of conflict. Why this here? Well, this was post-World War II in Germany and in Japan and other countries that were involved. But why this big area here? Anybody have any idea why we don't have a big area there? In countries today, the post-conflict countries today?
Mass impact.
Pardon?
Mass impact.
Mass and
Post-nuclear,
yeah, I mean, World War II destroyed, I mean, it really, there was nothing left in many places. But the peace came back fairly quickly. The reason is that they didn't have weapons back here. Not only do people have weapons when the war is over with, they have increasing weapons. And we see the pieces being militarized, so we sell them weapons. If you have weapons, there's a monopoly of weapons are going to be used. So we don't have any history with that, and it's what we call the monopoly of force. The other thing, too, is that we're finding the same kind of events that were called terrorist or whatever during the wartime, the same events, but now, for political reasons, they call them criminality or banditry. Okay? And if you remember, just recently, the UN General for Sudan said the war is over with. And everybody said, wait a second, I don't think it is. And he even said in his speech, he said, well, there's just now some banditry going on. Well, of course, I hope you just believe it. But the confounding variables in what you study, level of forces, and the available weapons. And that's what makes, quite honestly, most of the difference. The predictors of going back to war, returning to conflict, is just plain stagnation and health and economics and all the rest of it. And here we go with the infant mortality rate again, because it is the most sensitive indicator. And a worsening infant mortality rate. And I don't know how many, have any of you done international missions? And you know what we talk about, the emergency threshold? But the nice thing about studying this kind of stuff is that we take the epidemiology that you study and we use it every day. It's in our conversations, it's in our planning, it's in everything. But we have an emergency threshold which is greater than 2 per 10,000 a day of deaths. Right? And if that emergency threshold was there at the end of the, quote, war, and it still is there, and the public health system isn't adequate to take care of that, it's one of the reasons for returning to war. Also, these wars that we've been involving your history for so long, that are now not on the radar screen, they have less than 10% of the resource base to work from. Okay? And simply, too, if they just had a recent conflict, that's one of the main reasons to go back to war, because they don't know anything else. And the thing is, it was never really fixed. So 47% of the conflicts we've had over the last 3 decades return to war within a decade. And if you look at Africa, it's over 60%. Not very good. Now, the point is that this is the first time since 1994 that we have less declared wars, even though, as you just learned now, this is unpublished, but it will be published. that we have still levels of intensity. But the point is that this is the first opportunity we have to do something about it. And most of it is bringing back the public health infrastructure. These are countries that had it before. That is why they're leaving. That's why it's just stripped clean, especially in people who could leave, which was many of the educated. Biodiversity crisis. You need to understand that we have in the globe areas of biodiversity that are extremely important for the environment and the ecology, okay? And that's where, those are places that contain the majority of the world's plants and vertebrates, all right? Biodiversity hotspots, and this is strict criteria, is where the habitat for greater than 1,500 species of vascular plants have lost at least 70% of their habitat. That's an effect on the entire world, okay? And it should be of great concern. So I don't know how much you can see here. So this is South America, United States. Here we are, the big biodiversity area, all the crops that grow in the Sacramento Valley and things like that. The only country that the entire country is a biodiversity area is New Zealand. And I just got back from speaking in Auckland, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. But you can see these areas, and that's where, you know, most of which rely on our crops, and our animals, and all the rest of the stuff, if we treat it well. Because it's always a balance. But the darker spots are where we have had major wars. And the unfortunate thing is that the major wars have often occurred where the biodiversity, because they want the resources. They want that territory. Okay? Now that's changing this picture, but I want you to sort of hold on to that as we go. But what we know is that 80% of the major conflicts that I was just talking about occurred in 23 of the 34 most biologically diverse areas. Okay? If we look at Iraq, and you're not hearing about it, gang, because no one wants to tell you it. But for the last 2 years, they've had major droughts, major sandstorms. Only 13% of all of Iraq is arable land. And that's between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. If you've ever been there or flown over it, it's one of the worst deserts. And all of a sudden you see a river, and then zoom, you just see all these date palms and all the rest. It's all activity. It's absolutely amazing. But that's all disappearing. And also to add to it is the Tigris and Euphrates River come from Syria and Turkey in the north. Right? And what are they doing? They are damming them, very much like China dammed the Mekong River, okay? And where essentially the rice bed for all of Asia was, okay? And so the salinity is now coming in from the sea, and the rice crops are going there. Okay? So we have an environmental emergency right now. So as some people have said, well, I guess they'll use the oil money to buy food and that's not at all unusual, okay? War money, harvesting all the great timber in Cambodia and Congo, illicit drugs in Afghanistan, Southeast Asia, Latin America, okay? When other things should be grown. Proliferation of small arms, when they have the small arms, hey, God, we can shoot all these animals. So there's no balance now where hunters used to have. Heard about bushmeat, but now our supply of small animals at this point. And the lingering post-conflict kind of fighting, just failed recovery of those areas that need to come back if they are going to survive. Oceania, where I do a lot of work, and you're part of it, at least the East Coast thing, have 6 of the 34 hot spots, and the unfortunate thing is that it has a very, very poor record of extinction of both plants and animals. You are going to be dealing with this more than you realize. All of these are tied together. Climate change, well, think about what's called the boundaries framework. Threshold for 7 environmental indicators: climate change, biodiversity, global cycles of nitrogen, freshwater availability, ocean acidification from the CO2 emissions. But the point is that these 3 on the top have already gone over the tipping point. The scientists will say we don't know whether we can bring it back. But any change of any of these affects the other ones. All right? Certainly, he's over the top in many areas of the world already. Okay? So this is extremely important, and that's what we're really concerned about. But setting off mass migrations and mass conflict from these reasons, Lake Victoria, if you've ever been there, dropped 10 feet in 6 years. Rising temperatures, diminishing rains. I was telling Delhi because I go back, I remember in Nairobi in Kenya, God, I could walk around any time of the day or night. It was totally peaceful and things like that. And you can't, anything close to that. You get, actually, they tell you in the hotels to watch yourself as soon as you step out. But they're monstrous megacities now. Okay? Entirely different. But tropical diseases, their vectors change first. As it gets warmer, they can produce more because it's warmer during the time that they're producing. And so their vectors are moving from tropical to subtropical to non-tropical kinds of environment. One of the arguments during the Bush administration was the fact that, well, there's no indices to tell us that something's going on with climate change. Well, Mark Kine, who's worked a lot for CDC in Polynesia, has looked at this issue and found that, if you've ever been to Polynesia, I have, but I had to go back after many years. Islands that I remember now, all you see is some palm trees and water. But you can stand there for a year on the coast and say, I don't see the water coming any higher. Okay? The point is, you need to know the physics, and the water seeps under the island first. Okay? Disrupts the roots and the coconut palms, the taro, or whatever, and so it stops their growth. All right? These are all the Polynesian countries have an endemic vitamin A deficiency. Okay, but we can always supply that. But now we're seeing starvation for the first time. So starvation is the sentinel prophecy of climate change, at least for Polynesia. Challenges are quite different with each island, but essentially increased severity of the tropical cyclone because there's warmer water, right? So it can go further. General sea level rise, detrimental effects with increased acidification of the sea, and that's from the CO2, right? And warming of the coral reefs, and eventually collapse of those ecosystems. The migration pattern is different than what you saw in wartime in Iraq, Afghanistan, Africa, and things like that. But by 2050, and probably going to be before that time, about 75 million islanders will be forced to relocate. Now, as I said, I'm a professor in Australia, and they say it's our responsibility. They're already making plans to take the islanders in. But this is 75 million out of 900 million that are also people around the world that are going to be affected by this. So it's a difference here. This is regional rather than international. So we talk about the refugees, okay? This is a different issue. But they will be indeed refugees. Primarily driven by drought and soil degradation. But the first move is village to village. This is what we've seen in Africa. They call it crept after our living. So they creep over here, creep over there, things like that. Okay, it's interesting. The Africans are talking about moving more to the Mediterranean, and seasonal, sort of moving too back and forth, depending on the conditions, and that happens in Mexico. All right. In China has, and this is their quote, not fit for human habitation. This is land that's just essentially turned into desert. Over 150 million need to be moved, mainly from water shortages. So a lot of all the factories started on the East Coast, and a lot of great jobs for young adult males. A lot of people said, "Oh, they came for the economy." No, they left. They left. The young adult males left central China because there was no food anymore. Super dust storms, and a lot of the springs from the aquifers have decreased, and that's what's happening in Africa. You see decline, let's say, in Lake Victoria, but really what's way underneath the aquifers are disappearing. So that's a big concern, which we might not get that. So you get things like this. Shenzhen is is one of the economic zones outside of Shanghai. And if you go there, you say, God, it's more modern than any place in California. And it's really quite great. It's contributing to the environment, jobs, and things like that. This is all fallow land of the area that was then going to become Shenzhen. And this is it 25 years later. So all the blue areas, the dark blue areas, urban areas, just the white ones there are just new urban development, but it just sprung up like that. Now the point is that they'll say, gee, we're doing it for the economy. Then you go there, and actually China is a place that I go back almost 40 years. I was there during Tiananmen Square, and certainly during Mao's time or whatever, when it was really a very rural place, and there's a lot to do humanitarian-wise. But they will tell you, we had to build this because Shanghai, which is one of the most dense, different than population areas in the world, but their infrastructure, public health infrastructure, couldn't handle the new population. Now, I was speaking in Shanghai, and they said, we're going to drive you. It was about a 3-hour travel northwest. And so went on the big highway. I mean, and there were never used to be any cars there, but now they're all over the place. But anyways, they get off the road because they wanted a certain direction. But anyways, the driver got lost, and we went around and around, things like that. Finally, we went by some guard things, whatever, and then we drove in, and all of a sudden, I mean, we all looked like this, and there in front of me, in front of us, was this massive, massive city. But it was like a neutron bomb had hit it. A neutron bomb won't destroy the buildings, but it will kill the people. Everything was new. There were pharmacies, there were schools, there were apartments, there were everything, government buildings. Okay, massive, went on for miles and miles and miles. They were nervous as hell, okay, because I wasn't supposed to be there. They finally got out, finally got the thing. We didn't say anything about it. Then when we were reminded, because they said, don't say anything about it, Buxley, kind of thing. Don't say anything about it. And so I said, well, what is it? And it was the city of Tong, which they said in about 2 months, several million people will be moved there. So their response to, because there is a limit, isn't there, to the infrastructure and the water and all the rest of the stuff. And so their answer is to build new cities. It may be one of the best answers, we don't know. Australia, of all the developed countries, Australia is the most developed, the most vulnerable. Right? So they've had rising temperatures, low rainfall, bushfires like crazy, severe droughts, but winter rains in the west, like with Perth, okay, which now the mosquito breeding is going on. Okay? So Brisbane, which did have some dengue, the Aedes mosquito is now spreading all over. It's spread down to New South Wales and things like that. But dengue and Ross River fever and melioidosis haven't spread yet, but that's what we expect in the next decade. So this is the concept that happens. Large-scale natural disasters, this is important. Katrina, you all know the story about it, but about the public health people, there were 3 that did outbreak investigation and control. During the hurricane, 1 committed suicide, 1 died of a heart attack, there was 1 left. But New Orleans never had a lot of funding, so their entire surveillance system, all the things that tell you about the epidemiology of the population, et cetera, was done on paper. So when the floods came, that paper turned into pulp. So after the Katrina, they had absolutely no baseline epidemiology. And what's a Department of Health without that? Right? The citizens, however, and remember the Times-Picayune newspaper, which continued throughout the entire hurricane and afterwards, we kept reporting. They started to have more obituaries. And the citizenry said, why all these obituaries, and complained to the fledgling Department of Health. Department of Health turned to us at Harvard and went down and did a study and found that a year after, so this is excess mortality, again, the indirect, there was a 47% increase in the people who died in New Orleans since the hurricane. That's unprecedented. Because the public health system is disrupted, unable to provide basic surveillance. And of course, and these were not even included, but 2.5 million internally displaced. But do you know that that's more than the people internally displaced in Sudan and post-tsunami in the ocean system? Okay? So it's 10% of the total. Right? In the ocean tsunami, more money than God, right? Bush and Clinton getting all the money. But the money has gone to economics, because the economic theme is if you improve the economy, everything else will follow. Okay? Then the health system will get better, and the education system will get better, things like that. They had people on the beaches within 5 hours afterwards. But of all the countries that were hit by the tsunami, 3.5, now 4 years afterwards, large gaps in shelter, sanitation, potable water, health facilities, and workers. That was no attention, despite all that money, was given to it. Okay? So, 20 to 25 years, the experts recommend before it will get up. The real decision for New Orleans is whether the city should survive. Because it never should have been built in the first place. 38% fewer hospitals in New Orleans since Katrina. But this is the worst. 56% fewer inpatient psychiatric beds. Read that last sentence. The last psychiatric hospital, last psychiatric bed, and all of New Orleans closed this September. So are things getting better? And still about 32,000 kids who have never returned to school. So this is called the Katrina Pain Index because you have to have indices, don't you? Globalization. How many of you remember Alma Ata, or at least studied it? Okay, what was Alma Ata? Anybody?
Maybe from Mongolia?
Well, that's where it was. It's in Asia. It's in Asia. What was Alma Ata all about?
It was a declaration that everybody should have health care by the year 2000.
Yeah, the health indices. So it took people like you, who back in the 1950s said, just how many people are dying? Okay, they primarily focused on women and children. And they said, this is appalling. Okay, so this was the Alma Ata thing, in which essentially they said, by the year 2000, we'll have equity in terms of health. And they were really moving towards that. The wars, the conflicts, everything just stopped it. All right? But the other issues and was run by WHO, was it also said, look, health and education is a human right. So this is what was emphasized why this should be done. Okay? Well, that failed. Right now, or certainly before this economic crisis, World Bank has essentially dominated things. But as I said, their mantra is, if you can improve the economy, everything else will follow. Now, as a Woodrow Wilson scholar in D.C., I was not far from the World Bank. I became very, very a good student of it, but also increasingly critical. And there's some recent articles in Lancet that back me up on this. But if you look at it, there is no public health component to it. All right? And very little. They said, well, we have an epidemiologist from CDC. They weren't doing anything public health-wise we're talking about. Okay? But there's no health or human right component. They feel that health is a responsibility. That's what McCain said in that interview, where Obama said it's a human right. When McCain said it's a responsibility, nobody asked, well, what do you mean by that? The responsibility term comes from the World Bank, meaning that if you have a job or whatever, it's your responsibility to get it. Companies will also provide healthcare, but that just doesn't work. And during this time, gang, and this is the most important thing, there's been a net reduction in expenditures for public health, education, whatever, because in these cities where a lot of this, the economy has been, outsourcing and gone to, all of the health care was public health dominated. All right? Now, they built new hospitals, do it in India, but you can go get your bypass done, but the population can't. Okay? But during that time, there was enough coming from the coffers to try to maintain these public health facilities, laboratories, clinics, hospitals, whatever. All right? But even that time, nobody was putting money in to keep them maintained, just running. Because they said, oh, they'll all be replaced by the private sector. So the financial crisis happened, and guess what? We got a health tragedy worse than we did before. And in these cities, we have a large number of, we don't know who they are, but we think they're mostly young adults who are hoping that they will get a job. Right? And so where do those people go? They move to the disaster-prone areas in those cities. Okay? So during this time, we've had increasing health inequities and a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. The haves meaning those that did have jobs. But guess what? This is important. The have-nots have returned to those 1950s health indices. So we've gained absolutely nothing over those 40 years. Okay? But as I said, it's an invisible population in these megacities. We don't know the numbers. We don't know who they are. If you go to Lagos in Nigeria, it's primarily women who are widowed or single with 3 to 5 children who were escaping rural Africa. Remember, 67% of the population in Africa are now living in the urban settings. You think of Africa, rural and all the rest. No, they just abandoned villages. Right? But they go there for the security. Many of them have been raped. They get to the city looking for social services for themselves and their children. They're not there. They can't return. They turn to prostitution. Understand? The cycle just goes on. All right? So we don't know who they are. It's important for us when we go out there. We know in humanitarian operations who the population are. So the demographics have to be done. And quite honestly, do we have NGOs and UN working big time in the cities? Absolutely not. Okay? So this is a quote from many of these cities, not from us in the humanitarian community. Health for many has become, quote, a major security issue. So this is coming from their own mouths. Right? In China, they're being very transparent on this, but they now have 20 million, at least, minimum, newly unemployed. Primarily adult males who were sent by their villages, had jobs, sending money back to the villages. Okay? They're out of their jobs. The villages don't want them to come back because they might take the few jobs that they have away. So they're sitting there unemployed and no help. And what they call in China mass incidents are getting increasingly violent. You need to understand that the one country in the world for decades, not just recently, but for decades, has more mass violent incidents than any other country is China. But you don't hear about it because they also deal with it equally. There's a lid put on it right away. People come from the shadows and take care of it. And until this recent thing in the Northwest. And that's what's happening. So they're having less control over it. And this worries them. Okay? But again, we don't know the demographics of this. We just don't. That's going to be up to somebody in public health to really not only what relations are, but what are the two A's, access and availability. So the contradictions of globalization are you have the beautiful there and then the shanty towns. So in California, New York, Washington, D.C., 4 to 6% of the population are considered homeless or urban squatters. In these cities, 78%. Is that a problem? Is that a potential conflict? Yes. Okay. Do we know how to deal with it? Do our police know how to deal with it? Do the military disaster guard know how to deal with it? No. They're going to deal with it in a very conventional way, which will do nothing to cause more conflict. So nobody's really paying attention. This is a major public health problem. And the reason being also that you have to think beyond the courses that you're taking. Public health is the most composite discipline. And it's multidisciplinary, whether you like it or not. Okay? So I can understand why the economists and the lawyers and the engineers are going, okay? So what we're seeing now in the urban slums is we have the highest underage 5 mortality rate and the highest infant mortality rates. Wow. Okay. Urban shanty towns, about 100 million, growing about 25 million a year. In the Asian countries, they are growing about 1 million every 6 months. All right. Sanitation is being ignored, and infectious diseases are becoming more prevalent. Remember, Mother Nature's in charge, okay? So what, and I've been putting this up for years, but this shows that we have more people living in urban populations and rural populations, but it was supposed to happen somewhere around 2015, but it's about 5 to 7 years ahead. And that's what we're also finding in other issues that we're measuring in climate change. Emerging diseases, it really, really is a wonderful time to be a virus. And you need to understand why. Why do we have the 70 emerging and re-emerging diseases? Okay? The point is, I mean, if you go to Guangdong province in China, if you want to study SARS, you want to study avian influenza, it's there. It's where very, very dense human populations live with very, very dense fowl population birds. All right? And so it's a real setup. Okay? But we just have too many people. But it's not so much the population, it's the density of the populations and then the easy travel. So in Guangdong province, remember this quote, Guangdong province moved from Guangdong province to Hong Kong and then to SARS, went to 40 countries in 10 days. That's pretty massive. The other thing is we have, if you're looking at the H1N1, we're talking about the Maori in New Zealand, the Aboriginals in Australia. Why did more people, the indigenous people in Mexico and Argentina? Okay? These are people that genetically don't have any influenza A background, okay, to them to provide that. Because they never got it, they were always isolated. But the other thing is that we just can't blame it on that. It's also access and availability. So they got sicker, they didn't have access, and so more of them died because of that. Okay? But the grand experiment here, and please, until somebody read about this, like read about the international health regulations, which became a treaty in 2007. Because what has been done with that may end up being the health regulations for climate change, for food shortages, for all of those things. It is working, but it is the grand experiment. And you know, density is like pornography. I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it, okay? And here, you know, look at all these things. Look, it goes way back there. This is in Asia, this is in China. Now, most people, you know, say, well, gee, how do you get a hot dog or a hamburger? Well, people in public health ask what? Well, where are the toilets? You know where the toilets are. It's in the water, okay, or on the beach. But is that a public health problem for you? All right. But remember, this is what the population doesn't understand, all right? So we got a lot of duty. This is Polynesia, but Rick Bissell in the 1970s said of all the large-scale natural disasters, floods and hurricanes are the only ones that change the ecology. Okay? And this is what's happening. It changes the ecology consistently in Haiti, for example. Okay? But what happens is that, believe it or not, Polynesia is becoming urbanized because they're all in one area, okay? Population growth, density then increases, contaminated and polluted home water storage, wells, coastal areas, and of course, increased bacterial contamination. I mean, that would be the easiest question on any public health exam if we took, okay? Last thing, and this is the one to worry about, emergencies of scarcity. This is energy, water, and food. We are now getting intense distributional conflicts. And this is probably one of the most interesting, but the most dangerous of things that are emerging in front of us. Essentially, land has been taken away from poor people, farmers, for mines, for growing other things that are not indigenous. So the impact on the poor people and the fragile states are the greatest. And they are ones that lack social protections, the reason why you have those courses in public health, and also the political and institutional means to resolve it. Plus the fact that food prices have gone up about 83%. So meaning that poor people spend 80 to 90% of their meager income just in food. I mean, think about what you eat, okay? It's 10, 13%, okay? So Guatemala, interesting. Please study Guatemala. It's been one of the poor countries, but it's also got a big avant-garde population, a lot of rich people, hotels, and all the rest of the stuff. but 50% of the children in Guatemala are chronically malnourished or stunted. How in God's name did that happen? Meaning it's gone on. And the Mayan, 80% of those children are stunted. The issue is, for a long time now, they haven't had the money to buy food. Now with the financial crisis, it's gone over the tipping point. Okay? So has Guatemala been on our radar screen? No. We've been concerned with countries, boom, 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 and shooting at each other. Okay? So this is a different kind of situation. And how do you begin to control this? Okay? There's increasing resource competition between countries, and it's becoming aggressive, especially in countries that already and have for decades require their food from imports. Who are they? South Korea, Japan, China, and a range of Middle Eastern countries. They've always had to bring in food, okay? Purchase and produce energy, let's say oil or whatever, Africa, Arctic, South China Sea, Caspian Sea. But now we have countries investing in farmland in foreign countries. Farmers have no political voice. A lot of instances in countries because it increases the coffers of the countries. But anybody know the case of Madagascar? If this happened in one of our developed countries, it would be all over the press. 60 Minutes, Dateline, everybody would talk about it. And I think one of the most interesting things is I don't have a single hand raised in this class. Madagascar is a very poor country. It has a lot of arable land that has never been touched. And so in April of this year, South Korea, after a lot of negotiations, got a 100-year no-cost lease on half of all the arable land in Madagascar. They were to grow corn because corn is the main staple in South Korea, and also palm oil, which is a biofuel that they were going to have. Okay? It sounded good in the beginning because they said, oh, well, think of all the people that we will employ. And then it got a little bit deeper and deeper and deeper, including the fact that, guess what? When you lease that land, there was no cost. Because they said, oh, the economy will grow. You also have the rights to all the water. And that's as much water as is contained by Hoover Dam. So when this was found out, the populace went up in arms, as poor as they were, a political coup, and the first act by the guy that's in there now to stop this. But it is all over the place. And when I was in Auckland, remember when I told you all of New Zealand is a biodiverse area? Well, you fly a 3-hour flight from Sydney, which they were just going to have another dust storm. It's mostly desert, as you know, to New Zealand, and it is just emerald green all the time. And it rains a lot. It's emerald green. And just in the taxi ride, I was telling me, gee, the Japanese have just purchased 2 big islands, purchased this swath of land, this swath of land. It's all because of this. Okay? They're going to all the biodiverse areas and buying it up. Okay? So it's already becoming a conflict issue. And so it really, rather than looking at it in a global way, because we do have enough land to feed the entire population of the world, if indeed it's approached not by individual nation states, but by globally, okay? So we have a very fragmented approach to global health. We don't even really have global health because it really will require new institutions that eluded our process up to date and all the rest. Public health redefined. Humanitarian assistance certainly has moved from rural to urban areas. Humanitarian community is not prepared to protect the urban public health infrastructure or the system. I spent a good part of my life teaching people of all ages how to build defecation fields, pit latrines, refugee camps. It's not there anymore. How do you start building a well here? The worst. Understand? We do not know how to defend the public. Okay? And we certainly do not know how to handle the emergencies of scarcity, because the approaches, militarized, everything like that. If people rebel, are they then terrorists? Understand? How do we? I mean, this is a human right. It's at least expected, but we're not prepared for this. Last slides. The way in which we provided, this is how we do it, defining public health. Disasters keep governments honest by defining the public health, exposing vulnerability. That was what I contributed, because that was what my generation did. Okay? The disasters defined it, exposed it, we acted on it. Okay? Globally, scarcity, so climate change, water, energy, and food will define now the public health status of countries. They're already being, when you think about it, South Korea, Japan, whatever. Okay? The public health solutions, I mean, deforestation has got to stop, but reduction in growth rates, I mean, that's a biggie. But reduction in growth rates requires what? What is step number one? It's empowering women. And empowering women is not popular in most of the countries where this has been done. But when I went to Berkeley, there was an old codger of a guy who stood up in the amphitheater, and he said, you know, if you just do one thing, only one thing, if you just educated women, you'll see immediately that the mortality rate in children will go down. And you don't touch the children. Just do that. You know what? And it's true. It was true then, it's true now. We've been interrupted by all these complex emergencies, but it is just as true then as it is now. Ensuring social protections. So, you know, take those courses of public health very seriously, because they've got to be combined with the other things you do in public health, medicine, whatever. You decrease the carbon emissions, because it's what's producing the acidification of the sea, all right? And populations, and you'll hear these terms, populations are called upon to identify their vulnerabilities. Oh, we're getting back to that again. Learn how to reduce them. So the word on the street now is adapt. And there's now money for adaptation. And the money for adaptation should come, the developing countries feel that the money for adaptation should come from the rich countries. So the word is adaptation, okay? And that will redefine just how resilient populations are. Some will leave, some not. The important thing, if this doesn't work, then you have to have strong mitigation policies and plans in place. And so, last thing that you need to know, and that is I'm sending this article. I've sent it all over the world because it's so good. But we've suffered from expertise that's just too narrow in content. Research process, interaction, different facets of knowledge. But global health and public health is now very integrated. It's interdisciplinary, multi-sectoral, and it addresses the needs of multi-ministerial issues, okay? Leaving public health research to policymakers and practitioners who are poorly prepared to interpret strengths and weaknesses of integrated research. So I can recommend it, and I have, as Delia told you, to the UC system, starting out at UCSF. They didn't understand what it really meant. Their answer was to do more vertical silo kinds of research. That's not what we're talking about. And again, like infant mortality rate, global health is a composite field. And so even if you don't have an Institute for Global Health, your global health curriculum and your departments have to reflect that. They really do. So the conclusions, public health must take precedence over politics. It cannot be driven by political voters. And political interference and influence on public health has increased exponentially over the last 20 years because, and more so in the last 7 to 10 years, because governments know that they have to control the public health and the indices and the measures. And that's not the way it should be. But public health must be seen as a strategic and security issue. I've been saying this for many, many years, but the closest thing that has, since 1973, But the closest thing just happened this year in the G20 Global Impact and Vulnerability Act, which is measuring many of those things that I just gave you. So last slide is, thank you very much.